Welcome to our social policy presentation, brought to you by William Welch, Julia Larson, and Courtney Robison. Our social policy presentation is regarding the Social Security Act of 1935, with an emphasis on aid to families with dependent children, aid to families with dependent children within foster care, and the Indian Child Welfare Act. To start off our presentation, we're going to review the Aid for Dependent Children portion of the Social Security Act. Basic income is a necessity for survival. Aid to Dependent Children, or ADC, was a program created under the Social Security Act of 1935. This was enacted during the New Deal era of economic reform, which followed the Great Depression of 1929. Not surprisingly, the number of children, those eligible for public welfare assistance, increased during the Great Depression. ADC was a public welfare reform or program offering monetary assistance to children who were determined to be eligible through means testing. Typically, families that received ADC were mothers with dependent children where fathers were deceased, absent for some reason, or unable to work. The goal of the program was to ensure financial support and security to children who were deprived of one parent for some reason or another, and to make it possible for mothers to stay home with their children. The program's name was changed from Aid to Dependent Children to Aid to Families with Dependent Children in 1962, when eligibility was amended to permit assistance to households or families with two parents, including an unemployed parent. In 1996, through the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, or PRWORA, AFDC was replaced by Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. The Social Security Act of 1935 was enacted into law by President Franklin Roosevelt. Social reformers Grace Abbott and Catherine Linroot, who were affiliated with United States Children's Bureau within the Department of Labor as the current and previous directors. The Children's Bureau's goal was to provide financial support or aid to children of mothers who lacked supportive breadwinners, typically male breadwinners and the father of the children, with the absence of judgment regarding the circumstances of how they ended up in that position. Abbott and Linroot had strongly lobbied for this program to be added to the Social Security bill. The bill was written by the Committee on Economic Security, resulting in it being aimed at male breadwinners. Abbott and Linroot envisioned ADC to include both financial assistance and casework services in order to promote social work standards, to fight against stereotypes towards mothers receiving aid, and to provide mothers with support as caregivers, homemakers, breadwinners, and heads of the household. The intent of the program was to ensure mothers had access to the essentials for the family and rearing of children, and to bring relief from sense of dependency and inadequacy to those who received relief often experienced. It was also believed that the sense of security given to mothers with dependent children through assistance also assisted the mother with meeting the family's needs, and adequacy addressing issues as well as child rearing were paramount in preventing additional social problems such as juvenile delinquency of their children. It was postulated that a mother's contribution in the home as a homemaker to the family's children outweighed her worth as a wage earner. Prior to these ideologies, women in poverty seemed to be set up for failure, as mothers were expected to be both a homemaker and a wage earner, which often couldn't be successfully maintained by mothers, resulting in children who were significantly neglected and often juvenile delinquents. It was felt that many households absent of a male head of the household will require some form of public assistance. In 1960, what later became known as the Fleming Rule was implemented by the head of the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Arthur Fleming. The Fleming Rule was a rule prohibiting states from withholding ADC assistance from children who were considered illegitimate or born outside of marriage. This followed what was later coined the Louisiana Incident, where that state had kicked 23,000 children out of the ADC program due to the values of others regarding the home being suitable or not based on legitimacy or lack thereof of the children. The Fleming rule offered alternatives, such as providing services to make the home suitable or move the child to a suitable placement while continuing to provide financial support to the child via ADC funds. ADC changed to AFDC primarily for cultural reasons. One of the original goals of ADC was to provide financial security to children and allow mothers to stay home with their children. A sequence of changes, cultural, demographic, and policy shifts involving marriage, poverty, and women's employment weakened continued public support for that goal. Some felt that ADC inadvertently encouraged motherhood out of wedlock. Those concerns were brushed aside for the perception that, from a federal perspective, ADC was for mothers who were widows. They were seen as the most deserving of all mothers. In 1939, survivors' benefits were included in conjunction with standard Social Security, which is a separate aid to widowed mothers, allowing them to leave ADC in most circumstances. Eligibility for ADC changed, resulting in AFDC in 1962. ADC required needy children to be in the care of a parent or other close relative, however, did not specify assistance to any other family member aside from eligible dependent children. In 1950, the federal government began to take into consideration the cost of a caretaker relative, child, and an unemployed parent. In 1962, eligibility changes to ADC took place, allowing a second parent to be in the ADC household with the dependent child and a parent who was incapacitated or unemployed, and the name of the program was thus changed to AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. In 1996, through the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, AFDC was replaced by the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families program. TANF's goals included providing assistance to needy families so that children may be cared for in their homes or in homes of relatives, to end dependency on government benefits by needy parents through the promotion of job preparation, employment, and marriage, to prevent and reduce out-of-wedlock pregnancies, and to promote and encourage two-parent families. TANF was intended to drastically reform the welfare system to promote work and personal responsibility by requiring work, putting a limitation on the duration of assistance which could be received, and increasing the enforcement of payment of child support by non-custodial and or absent parties, among others. Families eligible for cash assistance through AFDC could receive cash assistance for several years in addition to other public programs such as Medicaid, food stamps, and public housing. TANF imposes time limits that a family can only receive 5 years of TANF assistance over a lifetime, which is a strong topic of public debate. Data regarding AFDC recipients show that 50% left the welfare rolls after 1 year, and that number increased to 70% after 2 years, which was promising. However, up to 75% of AFDC recipients who left welfare rolls returned to AFDC at some later point in time, demonstrating difficulty of maintenance of independent financial security. Much of the controversy involved with the TANF debate involves adequacy of funding, time limits, work requirements, child care, education and training for better jobs, job quality and availability, and equitability among states. Ever has it been that stereotypes and hostility have surrounded the subject of poverty and public welfare. Some saw privilege as being earned by hard work, and those who were poor were seen as being that way because they did not work hard to earn privilege, thus they must be lazy and without ambition. Those in poverty were thus seen as having character flaws due to their inability to compete. Opposing views understand that a few lost paychecks are the separating line between the average individual and welfare recipients. Now let's take a moment to review the data associated with recipients of the ADC and later the AFDC program, demonstrated on this slide. So who were the families being served by ADC and later the AFDC program? It's important to consider the demographics of the recipients of public welfare programs. Let's take a moment to review the demographics of the recipients below. Of the data. So what does it mean? The ADC-AFDC recipient population was large as well as wide-ranging. No family with children could be completely immune from potential circumstances warranting the need for assistance. While the recipients of AFDC were varied, certain groups were more at risk of requiring assistance. The highest rate of recipients were among those with poor education, low-paying jobs, and non-whites. There were certainly disproportionalities among certain groups, including minority groups. There were continuously revolving doors of welfare recipients, with new ones continually enrolling while others discontinued receipt of services.
ICWA was enacted by the 95th U.S. Congress. It was initiated by Senator James Abereski, who was a Democrat from South Dakota, on April 1st, 1977. It was initiated through the Senate Indian Affairs, House Interior, and Insular Affairs Committee. It was passed by the Senate on November 4th of 1977 and was passed by the House on October 14th, 1978 with amendments. President Jimmy Carter signed ICWA into law on November the 8th of 1978. In 2018, a documentary film titled Dawnland was released. This movie was based on the story of Abakai Beck, who was a native child removed in Maine in 1972. The Indian Child Welfare Act, which is ICWA, was established in 1978. It is a federal law that governs the removal and out-of-home placement of American Indian children. The law was enacted after recognition by the federal government that Indian children were being removed from their homes and communities at a much higher rate than non-native children. ICWA established standards for the placement of Indian children in foster and adoptive homes and enabled tribes and families to be involved in child welfare cases. ICWA sets federal requirements that apply to state child custody proceedings involving an Indian child who is a member of or a child eligible for membership in a federally recognized tribe. The intent of Congress under ICWA was to protect the best interest of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. It is important to note that in December of 2016, the Bureau of Indian Affairs did publish revised guidelines entitled Guidelines for State Courts in Indian Child Custody Proceedings. While these guidelines are not legally binding, they were the first revisions to ICWA since 1979. What the courts and child welfare agencies must consider in regards to ICWA is ensuring that diligent efforts are made to determine Native American heritage and tribe affiliation, providing active efforts to the family to help them contact the tribe, identifying a placement that fits under the ICWA preference provisions if that child would in fact be eligible for ICWA, notifying the child's tribe and the child's parents of the child custody proceeding, and working actively to involve the child's tribe and the child's parents in the proceeding. The way this works is at the onset of a CHINS proceeding, the court has a judicial responsibility during the advisement of rights to inquire with the parents and or guardians if the child and or child's family is affiliated or members of any official Native American tribe, or if that child is eligible for membership in any Native American tribe. If the family provides that they are, then the Child Welfare Agency is tasked with gathering information and reaching out to the identified tribe to determine if the family is in fact an official member and or is eligible for membership. If the family is, then the agency must follow ICWA regulations related to custody, care, and placement of the child. ICWA is classified as the gold standard of child welfare policy and practiced by a coalition of 31 non-native national child advocacy organizations. ICWA ensures that children and families receive the services they deserve. ICWA helps ensure that Native children are protected from abuse and neglect while being treated fairly. ICWA prevents Native children from suffering the trauma of unnecessary removals from their families. ICWA requires agencies and court to take into account not just the immediate needs of Native children, but also their long-term needs as they grow and move into adulthood. Child welfare best practice nationally is to place children with their family whenever possible. Research shows that all children fare better when placed with family. At least 26 states have agreements and or policies in place that are in support and in compliance with ICWA. Looking at what the studies do show, cultural identity and ethnic pride result in greater school success, lower alcohol and drug use, and a higher social functioning in Native children, adolescents, and young adults. Native children, adolescents, and young adults involved in their tribal communities and cultural activities have lower rates of depression, alcohol use, and antisocial behavior. Tribal language, ceremonies, and traditions are linked to a reduced risk of delinquent behavior of Native children, adolescents, and young adults. That being connected to culture is a proven protective factor for Native American children. There are some very important additional key points that should be noted when discussing ICWA. First is that tribal governments have a legal diplomatic relationship with the federal government. Today, there are 573 sovereign tribal nations recognized within the United States, which predate the formation of federal and state governments. ICWA reaffirms the inherent rights of tribal nations acknowledged through hundreds of years of federal law and policy. The United States Constitution affirms the unique political status of tribal nations and Native people. ICWA applies to children who are citizens, referred to as members in ICWA, of a federally recognized tribe. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly found federal laws that specifically govern tribal citizens constitutional. Citizenship requirements vary from tribe to tribe, just as citizenship requirements vary from country to country. ICWA does not apply to individuals who merely self-identify as American Indian or Alaskan Natives. They must in fact meet the criteria for membership into that tribe. In October of 2018, the United States District Court for the Northern District of Texas ruled in Bracken versus Zink that ICWA is unconstitutional. This, however, is still being challenged by ICWA authorities, and the result may end up getting overturned.
Some of the movies and books that influenced social policies were Little Orphan Annie, a daily American comic strip created by Harold Gray. By the 1930s, during the Great Depression, it was revised. Daddy Warbucks lost his fortune due to a corrupt revival and ultimately died from despair of the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Annie remained an orphan and for several years had adventures that involved more internationally based enemies. The contemporary events taking place in Europe were reflected in the strips during the 1940s and World War II. Daddy Warbucks was reunited with Annie as his death was changed to coma, from which he woke in 1945. Room for One More, made in 1952, Annie and Poppy Rose are the average American family with 3 quirky kids. Annie's heart was so big that she gave orphan Jane a home, who was a problem child that already tried to kill herself once. At first, Poppy is worried and wanted to get rid of her, but with love and patience, they finally managed to integrate her into their family. Just then, Annie invites another orphan, the aggressive handicapped Jimmy John, to their summer vacation. Annie of Green Gables, an orphan girl sent to an elderly brother and sister by mistake, charms her new home and community with her fiery spirit and imagination. Some of the national security issues were World War II was a global war that lasted from 1939 to 1945. 5 short years later was the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. The Korean War was a war between North Korea and South Korea. The war began in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States liberated Korea from Imperial Japanese colonial control in 1945. The Gulf War lasted from 1990 to 1991, Bosnia War 1992 to 1995, the Kosovo War 1998 to 1999, the Global War on Terrorism 2001 to 2013. This war on terror, also known as the Global War on Terrorism, is an international military campaign launched by the United States government after the September 11th attacks. 2001 to 2014 was the war in Afghanistan, and Iraq was 2003 to 2011. Currently, Republicans hold the majority of the Senate, while in the House, the Democrats hold the majority. President Donald Trump has been in office since 2017. He is a member of the Republican Party. 2018, President Trump signed into law the largest ever increase in child care development block grants to states. In 2017, the federal government spent over $700 billion on low-income assistance. President Trump stated it shall be the policy of the federal government to reform the welfare system of the United States so that it empowers people in a manner that is consistent with applicable laws and the following principles, which shall be known as the principles of economic mobility.
We hope has been demonstrated through our presentation. Social policy is important in many different ways and has affected clients for previous decades and centuries and currently affects clients today. And for those reasons, it's important that workers in the social service profession are knowledgeable and competent about social policy practice and how it affects our practice moving forward.